I wanted to recommend to the company leaders out there 3 internal podcasts that I think you should be doing and releasing at your organization. So these are podcasts that are released exclusively to your employee base. They're not for public consumption. So you would kind of lock these down and release them to your employees. And of course, you know, when it comes to podcasts, these are they're a great way for companies to foster skill building and learning and development. They're a great internal comms approach. They're very efficient, very effective. So the first podcast that I would recommend you do is one that I would call Hire Learning, HIRE. And this is more of a talent acquisition candidate experience podcast. And the reason I recommend this one is, and I think a lot of the HR, talent acquisition, recruiters, hiring managers out there are going to agree with me on this. When it comes to the candidate experience, a lot of candidates are getting interviewed at an organization and it's all going well until the recruiting team or hiring managers or what have you have to hand off those candidates to the team, to the, let's say, leaders or managers of the team that they're going to be working on. The people who are not in talent acquisition or in that role, but this person's going to be working on their team. And a lot of times that's where it starts to fall apart, because these folks will make a lot of mistakes. And it really does end up turning the candidates off. I mean, they're not prepared. They're not reviewing resumes. They're talking about the company. They're acting arrogant, like this is the greatest place to work and you should be lucky to work here. And it really is destroying the candidate experience. And a lot of candidates are walking out going, this isn't the place for me. So the experience kind of falls apart. Now, Hire Learning as an internal podcast would feature talent acquisition, recruiting folks, hiring managers from your organization who can focus on providing those other people who have to interview candidates, who it's not their day-to-day job, with some tips and recommendations to help them interview better and to really keep that keep it as a positive candidate experience. So you might focus on, here's ways to prep for an interview when you're going to be interviewing a candidate. Here are things to do and not do during the interview when you're with a candidate. And here are even ways to follow up with a candidate or to respond to a candidate that follows up with you. All those kind of things you can focus on, but it's really necessary. And I think would be very helpful to a lot of folks in the organization who just don't interview on a day-to-day basis. It's just not their job. So they end up kind of screwing things up here and there. So Hire Learning is one internal podcast I would recommend. The next internal podcast that I would recommend is one that I would call, and you can give this kind of different names. Sometimes I call this Up and Down. Sometimes I call this Mind the Gap because of the generation gap. But this focuses on, I think a lot of companies out there love to focus on what leaders and senior level folks can teach the younger folks inside of an organization. So it's very top down. And they'll teach them about lessons they've learned or strategies or leadership tips and recommendations, all those kind of things. But I think it's just as important for the younger folks in an organization to go up and teach the more senior level folks, because they know a lot of things that the senior level folks don't know. So this is a podcast where you would have episodes that almost kind of one after the other, or however you want to schedule that. You would have a senior leader talking in one episode about maybe a leadership principle or one of their strategies or one of the, their point of view, and providing that insight and that lesson to the rest of the organization, including the younger folks in that organization, as a, let's say, learning and development kind of tool or initiative. But then on the next episode, you would have one of the younger folks doing the same thing. So here's something that the rest of the organization can learn. And I think we all know that, younger folks in an organization, they take a lot of hits. They take a lot of shit. But they have a lot of knowledge as well. So this is really a a top down and down down to the top kind of learning and development podcast that could be really useful. And also it does a lot of things as well. It really does show that you respect all the voices within your organization. A lot of companies talk about that, but they don't necessarily, let's say they don't really live up to it. But in this case, you would be doing that. So up and down, or mind the gap, or whatever you want to call that. But that would be that internal podcast. The third internal podcast that I would recommend is one that I would call, let's say, once again, could have a couple names. I like the name COLLABOR-TIVITY, which is collaboration and creativity kind of coming together. Another one might be ABCD, which would be always be connecting dots. The whole idea of this is to foster thought diversity. And I think a lot of folks out there are talking about thought diversity and what that means. And here's how you can go out and get those perspectives, whether it be internally from other teams that you wouldn't necessarily think to collaborate with, or even externally by looking at different areas and disciplines and folks in different fields to find information that you might be able to use and connect the dots back to the problem that you're trying to solve. So in this case, this would be a really interesting internal podcast where people could actually talk about times that they went out and they learned from other groups, other departments, and talk about those case studies. It could also be about times that they went out and they learned from completely different industries. Like, oh, I learned about this from a pit crew, or whatever it might be. But when people hear those stories, that inspires them and it shows them how this is possible. Solving problems, building skills, those kind of things can happen by talking to people in other areas and other disciplines and other fields and other departments, even internally. It's a really interesting podcast that brings to life case studies, which of course you're going to probably want to keep confidential. That's why I'm saying this should be an internal one or a private one podcast. But just a great way to foster thought diversity. So if that's something you're interested in doing, and it's something that you're out there kind of waving that flag, I would recommend you do this podcast as well. So that's 3 internal podcasts that I think of all of you should be doing or at least considering.